I can hear you great, man. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, sounds good. How you doing?
Rock and roll. I'm so good, man. I'm just kind of ending the day. Just had some dinner, so recharged a little bit. How
Nice.
about you?
It's all it will be recharged after this weekend, but just got done with all the the finals and everything, and I am feeling it. But it was a good semester too, though. It ended on a good note. So
Good. Your last final was yesterday.
yep. Mhm.
Remind me what class it was
Yeah.
again.
That one was biological chemistry.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, good for you, man. You're plugging along with the sciences. This is I don't know how much you're learning right now applies to what we're going to discuss tonight, but I imagine there's some sort of physiological connection there, right?
Yeah, I mean there always is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the topic for today's discussion, periodization, and I'm really excited for this, man. I'm not gonna lie. I've been waiting to do this for a long time with somebody that I wanted to talk to this about. I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday. I think we'll try to do some intros, talk about some terminology, just really get some baseline concepts out of the way. And then I'm sure we'll dive into 100 different directions and get a little nerdy with a few things. I'm a big fan of that. I think it's going to bring a lot of context to people that are I guess that curious when they hear a presentation or learn. So that'll be really fun for us. Maybe as just sort of a checks and balances, if I start flying off into the sky into some stuff that you're just like, dude, you need to just stop talking. You just feel free to say that to me, and I'll just cut it. I have a tendency to float around sometimes, so
I feel like that'll happen the opposite way too. I'll get on a
okay.
tangent pretty quick, and
Well, we might be
you're
in
like,
trouble
"Wait,
then,
what were we talking about?"
no,
Oh, it'll be good.
this
It'll
is a
be
really
good.
fun conversation. Yeah, this is a really fun topic. It'll be cool to see. What is that fish behind you? Is that a shark?
Yeah. So it's let's see.
A
Let me
fish
angle
then.
that right. Yeah, it's kind of just like a little, like,
Cool.
couple paintings that come together as a
Yeah.
painting. I don't know how
Yeah.
well you could
Nice.
see that there,
Yeah, I could just see
but
the tail of it. Yeah, that's cool.
yeah, Kiara
Oh,
likes the sharks. So
let's do this, man. So as far as intros go, if you had a client ask you, one of your athletes, what's periodization, what the heck would you say?
I guess it would depend which client asked me, but let's say
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know this person. I would start by saying periodization is a way to plan for your training, a way to
Yeah.
like if you have, you know, you want to compete this day, not even compete. It's just a way to plan your training out. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe you could say it as simple as that.
I really like simple when it comes to this stuff, man. I don't like how everybody tries to make this rocket science, and usually there's an agenda there, right? If somebody's talking about periodization, they're trying to sell their like online programming, or they're trying to sell their coaching, and by all means, should individuals that spend a lot of time with this material and are familiar with it, and are higher level coaches, should get paid. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think there is an agenda there to make this a little bit more complicated than it is. And you know what? I can,
Yeah.
if it's okay with you, I'd like to run through the definition from the NSCA, National Strength and Conditioning Association, and the reason I want to bring that definition up is just to say, at face value, as far as coaches go that have a strong science background, it's a good definition, but it's almost an intimidating one. So here's how it reads, according to the NSCA: periodization may be defined as a training plan whereby peak performance is brought about through the potentiation of biomotors and the management of fatigue and accommodation. And so, as you can tell right off the bat,
It's a
we're
good
using some
definition.
yeah, but we're using some jargon, right? And I think that jargon is going to turn a lot of people away. They hear a word like
Yeah.
potentiation, and then they hear biomotors, and I think it just sort of scares a few people off. But this stuff
You
is
know,
is actually not that complicated. Go ahead.
yeah, and I agree with you there is I think anytime that you hear people start throwing in words to make it confusing,
Mm-hmm.
you're not working with the right person. I think I could totally be wrong here. But I'm pretty sure it was Einstein that said you should be able to, like, if you're smart enough, you should be able to explain something to anybody. I can't remember what the quote is. It was really elegantly put. But basically, the idea is if you know it well, you can teach it. So like if you have a professor and they can't dumb it down for you and make it relatable, it might not know the subject as well as they're, seeming to know. But if you know it well, you should be able to dumb it down and relate it to anyone. You don't need big fancy words to make it sound more confusing than it is.
Yeah, I totally agree, man. And I think that, I mean, the way that this word potentiation, the way it's used, it's really used several different ways. And so if readers go out and let's say they're actually going to go as far as, I want to look at some articles on periodization, and maybe they're looking primarily, they're probably going to land in a strength and conditioning journal, right? Like the NSCA's journal. That's where a lot of this literature comes from. And the funny thing is that this word gets used interchangeably quite a bit. So if you're looking at strength and conditioning research, there's a really solid chance that the word potentiation is just going to mean enhancement. And it's almost like this synonym that's just used as the word enhancement. And so, I think that will help people whenever they're looking at the word, not be, confused by it, not be intimidated by it. But then I think the reader should be aware that if you see this word and it doesn't seem to line up with that, and it doesn't really fit as like a word that would be similar to enhancement, there's also a few other things that potentiation could mean. And if you were to look at a textbook on something like plyometrics, then they might be referring to like a force velocity relationship of like a muscle's contractile ability based on the stretch reflex. So that's another word for potentiation. And then the last one that honestly, I think as I've read some of the journal articles, the strength and conditioning journal articles, I think they're actually alluding to this term as well without even knowing it. I really do. And the last one is what you'll find in like a neuroscience research paper, which is we're talking about sort of the strength of increasing the strength of a nerve impulse along a pathway that's previously been used. And so in that case, we're talking about like a motor pathway, and then we're talking about motor skill training. And I feel like some articles I've read, they're talking about that pathway, but I don't think they know that they're talking about that pathway. So I just wanted to mention those so that somebody doesn't say, I don't know what the heck this potentiation is.
Yeah, I
What are
think
your
I've
thoughts on
seen it. No, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's something I didn't even consider because that word gets thrown around a lot.
It does.
And I think the really most I've heard it, especially in powerlifting, is they call it strength potentiation. They use the term strength potentiation, meaning that, and the way they use it is that they're like, we're going to start with let's say you're squatting that day, and they'll start their squat session with a heavy squat, like a heavy squat single, and then they back off. And they're like, oh, but it encourages strength potentiation, then your back down sets are better. And that has become a fairly common thing with the top set single. But the interesting part on that is, and I wish I had this article, but the strength potentiation when used that way is not effective for very long. So you would have to, like, let's say, you're squatting at, 85%, I think is what usually they say the threshold is, like 85 to 90% top single to activate your strength potentiation. And then, but you'd have to, and there is something to it. There really is something to it. And I don't know if it falls more onto that like CNS side of things with the motor pattern or whatever, but you only have about a 90-second window after that for that to move into your next set. So you'd have to take that weight and hurry, drop some weights off of that, and then go. And then you'd have to do it for another set and go. And you could activate, there could be some benefit to that strength potentiation. But the way you typically see it used is you do a top set, at 300 pounds, 85% for maybe somebody. And then 10 minutes later, they're backing down to like 215. It's like, well, you kind of lost the benefit of any, but there isn't, I haven't seen a ton of research on actual strength potentiation when it comes to specifically powerlifting either. But that word gets thrown around a lot. And I know people that like that word like to say it because they feel like they're smarter than other people too. Like, whoa, the strength potentiation effect. And it's like, okay.
Well, in that case, you could really use the word interchangeably. I mean, because if we say strength potentiation, we're talking about maybe like a strength power enhancement. And in that case, I think what's probably on their minds, at least I would assume, would be like the research on post activation potentiation. And that's kind
I
of
would,
just like what you're talking about. Is basically they're just using an exercise to sort of create this after effect that where you see like this acute performance enhancement.
right.
And I think the most common is, at least within the research, isn't necessarily squat before squat. It's a little bit more squat before a heavy squat before like a vertical jump or a counter movement jump. I have not heard that there's only a 90-second window, though. You might be educating me on that. I think I've seen some of these study protocols. Maybe I'm remembering them wrong, but I want to say there were several minutes between, or up to several minutes between the heavy squat and the jump. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a minute and a half. I thought I remember it being somewhere along the lines of 3 minutes or so.
Yeah, and I could have my
But maybe
time
there
off a
is a
little
window.
there.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, yeah, I just kind of threw out a number there, but it's
Mm.
relatively quick.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And it's not something that like you do and then, you kind of hang out, you eat your gummy bears or
Mhm.
whatever, and then you take
Your gummy
another,
bears.
you throw, yeah, and then you take your belt off, you're kind of sitting there, and then, okay, it's like you kind of lost the effect of that, right? It's
Yeah.
not
Yeah. Yeah.
like you do that and then you're good for the rest of the workout.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you kind of lose the effect. And the way you said, like a heavy squat and then doing a vertical jump makes a
Mhm.
little bit more sense, I think.
Mhm.
But either way, yeah, I think that we're kind of missing out on what that actually, is and what that implies and how to
Yeah.
practically use it.
Yeah, let's see. Let's keep kind of flowing with this definition so we can really kind of bring it all together. So where we are now, as we said so far, we've got periodization may be defined as a training plan, which I think that's the bread and butter part of it. Then it says whereby peak performance is brought about through the potentiation, which we've covered now, of biomotors. Biomotors is really simple. Just break it down: bio, life, and then motor or movement, just to move, right? So biomotor. And generally speaking, and I think we'll keep this in the context of strength and conditioning, we're talking about, the biomotor abilities. We're looking at like strength, endurance, speed. Um, you also see flexibility and balance, coordination sort of thrown together. But I think in the context of this conversation, we're really talking about strength, endurance, and speed. And the reason that those are the big three is because, you're noticing I'm not mentioning the word power, but if we look at sort of, velocity and force, if we're talking about those two combined as a product, then we are talking about power. And I think another term people are going to see very, very commonly is going to be rate of force development. So it's not just strength, but it's how quickly that strength you're able to actually, the rate at which you're able to produce that strength. And so if you're like a power lifter, we might be talking about maybe a little bit more focused on maximal strength. And that, by and of its nature, if we test maximal strength, you will be doing a slower velocity. That's just the reality behind the maximal strength is. I think that the evidence I'm familiar with is you're talking about greater than 300 milliseconds, where if we're talking about a sport, football, basketball, where we need to be able to produce that strength very quickly, that may not carry over as well. So then we might be talking a little bit more about the product than just maximal strength. Although that's debatable, and I'm sure you do velocity profiles and things like that in powerlifting, but does that make sense?
Yeah, no, you're kind of just talking about the law of specificity. Just like
Yeah.
in order to get better at something, you kind of need to do something relative to what you're trying to get better at, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like if you want to be a good like power lifter, if you're trying to squat as much as you possibly can, there's probably not going to be a ton of benefit to getting really good at your half marathon. Like the idea is like whatever you're doing, like, and again, like if you're a track athlete, you're a 100-meter guy, building up a 700-pound deadlift, that's not really, it might have some weird correlation there, but it's not going to really directly impact your performance. So like I would say, I mean, maybe I'm going off a little bit of what you were getting at, but the idea is basically like you need to be, whatever you're doing, if that you're trying to peak, you need to be making sure whatever you're doing is going towards that peak. So if you're trying to squat a lot, the squat should probably be involved, or at least some type of like, because the squat is, again, very, very slow. It's going to be a slow lift. If you are truly doing a max effort squat, that can be a 4-second lift. Like that can be a
Yeah,
very, very
yeah,
slow lift.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
doing a whole bunch of box jumps are not slow, right?
Yeah,
So, that's your box jump doesn't correlate because you have a really big vertical jump does not mean you're going to have a really big, squat and vice versa. They are quite a bit different. So you need to train that accordingly. So like a lot of times I see some people get a little bit too involved with, I really like velocity training, so I'm not bagging on it
yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
it's got a
Me
time and
too.
place, but you're getting a little bit
Absolutely.
too obsessed with velocity training when you're getting near a time to peak. And it's like, well, there's a lot more involved with that because when you're sprinting or jumping, you are not braced. You are not trying to brace. You're trying to let the muscle like elongate. When you watch sprinters sprint, they are not like tight and braced. They're not bracing, they're not tightening everything in. They're very loose. And that is the exact opposite with a squat. You are very tight, which is going to slow down the motion. So,
Oh, well,
not that
maybe
they,
with the exception of your starting block, right? Your very
yes,
first explosion off the block would be a little bit different. But you're right when you say that the goal is not to create as rigid of a trunk. I mean, you do have, your core, core muscles, trunk muscles contracting, but it's not about contracting to the degree where it's a maximal effort isometric abdominal contraction. We're talking about being able to hold some degree of contraction, but also have optimal mobility throughout the limbs, which includes the pelvis. And so, yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying makes total sense.
yeah. But then on the
Yeah.
flip side,
Mhm.
this is what I was talking to you about yesterday, is people will see like research that comes out says, well, working on velocity work uh, has not helped people with their 1 rep max over like, I don't know, a 4 or 8 week period.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know, I'm just throwing something out there. I'm sure there's studies on that, but I've heard a
Yeah,
lot
there
of
are.
people talk negatively about, velocity training and helping your 1 rep max. And it's like, well, there's a time and place for everything, right? If you're trying to peak something, maybe velocity work at the very, very end and only doing velocity work, you actually need to practice what you're doing still, right? There should be a heavy squat in there every once in a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but don't take these things out of context is my point. Is like when you see something that says like this did not improve, 1 rep maxes or maximal strength,
Hmm.
um, just because that happened for a 4, 6, 8, 10 week period or whatever, and then they retest your 1 rep max does not mean that can't improve your 1 rep max in the future. That just means it didn't help you peak your 1 rep max at that time.
Well, I would also sort of counter to that, I think the statement that doing velocity based training, suggesting that it won't help a 1 rep max that's a very linear comment. And the reason I say is because velocity, based training includes things like velocity profiles to try to correlate with a percent of 1 rep max to help you, with your appropriate load during your training. So you can gain some sort of accuracy whenever you say, this is my 3 rep max, you have some degree of accuracy with that. And if that's how
Yeah,
it's being utilized, and we have seen data that it does correlate well with the percent of 1 rep max, if that's how it's being utilized, then I don't know how you can come up with the idea that it doesn't help a 1 rep max. That's almost like saying that, coming up with a percent of a 1 rep max and using it for training doesn't help a 1 rep max. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to prove that in a study. And I can confidently say I haven't seen one study that showed, and I don't think that I don't think it exists, that purely velocity based training doesn't improve a 1 rep max. It would have to be this specific method utilized, not just
yes,
that
I
in
agree.
general. That's way too generalized.
And so when you're talking, when in the powerlifting world, when you're talking about velocity based training, quote
Hmm.
unquote,
Hmm.
they're
Yeah.
talking about movements that are only above, I think it's like 0.75 or zero point 0.8 meters per second. And then they decide
Oh,
that that is velocity work, right? That is like
okay.
what they have decided. But the way you're
All right.
talking about it is using it almost to replace the RPE system. It's like you're kind of taking out what you feel and just
Hmm.
going with the data. Like I took this weight, I moved it this fast, right?
Yeah.
Um, and
Or
if
at
you
least
can build
correlate it with an RPE too, right?
right, yeah,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
more data you have, the more you can say like, even as you're training in real time, you can say, hey, normally I move 500 pounds at this speed. It's quite a bit slower today, and I'm supposed to
Hmm.
do something heavy. That's probably
Yeah.
not a good sign. Maybe let's back
Yeah.
off today, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
the opposite, where you're like, well, I was supposed to do this. 500 is supposed to be my top single, and it moved at like, 0.5 meters per second, something pretty
Yeah.
quick. And you're like, well,
Yeah.
I got a
Yeah.
lot left in the tank. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
can kind of help take out the mental, emotional decision of like what, if you get an RPE, if you use that, which, a lot of people do like the RPE system,
Yeah.
it can kind of take that out and replace it with something a little bit more tactile.
Yeah. 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 Um, Okay. So the very end line here is they add in, they're also referring to the management of fatigue and accommodation. In this case, you already alluded to a little bit, although you're talking about velocity-based training, we do have to monitor and continuously monitor fatigue and as well as accommodation. These are almost not quite opposing terms, but when we say accommodation, we're almost viewing accommodation as somewhat of a negative, although it's easily also viewed as a positive. So in this case, if your athlete accommodates to the training program, essentially the suggestion is that we haven't done enough variety in the program to keep that accommodation continuous. In other words, they've sort of reached a plateau because they've accommodated to the training stress. And I think at the flip side, we have to monitor fatigue, and then we're basically using these tools, this designed program, to try to minimize accounts of accommodation and fatigue. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, yeah, it
Yeah.
does. It's a good way to just really keep track of things in general, I think.
Yeah, and I almost feel like it's, I don't know how you think about this, but again, just talking about, nomenclature, although it can be a little boring to hear, sometimes this stuff does matter, so that whenever these conversations unfold between coach and coach, coach and clinician, coach athlete, pick which one you want, that we're basically saying the same things, and we're not just throwing terms out there. And so I think one of the things I hear often is it seems like periodization, which, with your bread and butter definition, I had a very similar one, by the way. Mine was, periodization is a training plan with the aim of ultimately improving performance, often with some specific dates in mind. So I like when you say, periodization, just think training plan. I think that's very reasonable, very straightforward. Although we've introduced some little nuances to it, at face value, it's just a training schedule, right? It's really not that crazy of a concept. But I think that periodization and programming are often used interchangeably, and then that gets a little confusing, and it's done within some of the literature as well. And if we try to separate them, I think some authors, and I agree, we view periodization as it's like the organization and timing of these protocols that produce these adaptations, but the programming, that's what sort of drives that adaptation during each training phase, right? So programming, we'd be talking about like your exercise selection. We're talking sets, reps, rest, load selection. And these are the strategies that, alongside the scheduling, which is the periodization, that's like that. Those two are sort of the bread and butter concepts, but they are, I think they're worth separating. Do you agree or disagree with that?
No, I do agree, because you don't necessarily have to have any kind of periodization inside of programming, right? Like, you can have programming, to me, is just the organizing of a workout on a very day-to-day or week-to-week level. So you could be talking about like, oh, here's your work. A coach could just say, here's your workout today, and call it. And that's technically, I guess, programming. Like, you are constructing a training regimen.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, periodization would be more like, okay, what if we zoom out? What is the grand plan here? Like, where are we going, and what tools are we using to get there, right?
Mm-hmm.
While like you're talking about more long-term phases, but programming is just like, okay, now that we have this idea that I want to do, I want to focus on this weakness during this time period, and then move into this, and then use that to move into this where we peak. And then programming is like, okay, let's fill in all the details now, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we're, in order to accomplish this goal, if I'm working on my aerobic capacity,
Mm-hmm.
and that is going to be my first block of periodization. How am I going to work on my aerobic capacity? How do I progressively overload my aerobic capacity so that I can adapt and get better, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you can periodize something very, very well, and the grand scheme can be great, but if you don't nail out those details and individualize it, you're gonna miss it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely could. And I think that brings up, I think it brings up a very reasonable, I guess, criticism of traditional periodization models, which are this sort of, sometimes this, you have this predefined outline with a you have a predefined date in mind. So maybe my competition is in February and I've got this last maybe like month block up to that very last day. So we have this sort of concept outline. The blueprint's already there, the map's already there. One of the criticisms is, well, then we might have a less, or it might be so stringent that we have less ability to alter that training in real time. So that's when you have, things come in, like we're looking at block methods where, we've got these predefined blocks, but we might not be able to regulate them appropriately sort of in the moment. And there's a lot of reasons for that, I think. A coach maybe he's got a program designed for 30 athletes, and every single athlete's going to come in and half of them drank all night the night before. The other half actually got a good night's sleep. I mean, these things are actually, they can be really complicated. So when this stuff gets designed and we're talking maybe more of this kind of highly skilled level, that's when all these nuances really come about. And that's when the high skill comes in, is to be able to adapt those things in real time. But again, I think dumbing it down at its core concepts, which is what we're going to try to grasp today, the actual map itself, the periodization, is, again, it's not rocket science. And so if you're trying to do it yourself, or you're just trying to say, look, I'm paying for this program, I kind of want to be able to just look at it and say, like, is this a reasonable program, or does this have no merit at all? I think that I'm still hoping, with this material that we're covering, we'll be able to do at least that. And then I'll also recognize there are highly skilled individuals that do deserve to be paid for their services that do these things. But I think you and I can both agree, Jake, that because the field of strength and conditioning, personal training, take your pick now, they're all kind of thrown into one, it's largely unregulated. And so you have these trends that go about, and then you have people that follow these trends. And then so you have individuals that are just saying what other people say and just sort of flowing along, and yet they're charging all this money for all these online programs, and then it just becomes a little bit of a mess. And I'm really, for one of the reasons I'm passionate about this topic is because when I get an athlete and they're injured, that's one of the first things on the table that we have to talk about is training. We have to talk about your training schedule if you're an athlete. So what does your program look like? And that can be a discouraging process when I look at these programs that were created online, and they have no foundation to them at all. And you can tell that it's just one of these little like copy and paste templates. I bet I could find it on Google if I tried hard enough.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think that it's a very worthwhile goal to review the concepts in enough detail that we can create some context and give some good information for people to use.
So first thing, if you want to know if you got a good program or a good coach, let's say you have a coach that you're paying for right now,
Mm-hmm.
you should not be paying your coach to, like, this is a hard stance, but I'm going to say it anyway. You shouldn't be paying, like, you can periodize yourself. You can get on the internet and you can find a periodization plan yourself just fine. You should be paying your coach for his ability to adapt to what is happening now, because
Mm-hmm.
you are a person that has emotions.
Yeah.
And you're going to have things like, man, I didn't sleep a couple nights. I had this, I lost my job.
Mm-hmm.
That throws off like your perfect plan, right? And if you have a coach that is just going to say like, oh yeah, go try your workout or whatever, not a good coach. He or she should be able to adapt on the fly. That is what you are paying them for, is to help those little details. Because again, like if you think of periodization as like, here's the long-term plan, well, dang, you can go to Google and find some kind of 20-week strength program if you're 20 weeks out or 6 weeks out or whatever.
Yeah.
And you can just follow that if that's all you're going to get. But that person should be able to say, okay, here are your weaknesses. Point them out to you. This is how we're going to work on them. And then if things are not going right, be able to adapt and be able to change things too. And if that's not happening, you don't have a good coach. Like it's just as simple as that. You need to be able to change, be able to adapt to what's going on.
Yeah. And I think that there are several benefits that should be there when you're working with a coach individually. And I mean, when I look at coaches at the highest, maybe we're talking collegiate coaches, or coaches that are dealing with professional athletes. They have these giant organizations for the most part that they have when they have funding, where it's not just the coach. You've got the coach, and then all the way down the line, you've got trainers, you've got a strength and conditioning guy involved. You've got all these people there, and the idea is that you have this large group of individuals that everybody's invested a lot in, but these individuals need individualized attention. They can't all follow the same program, nor do they for the most part. I mean, you can see, in college, you'll see groups coming in to do their strength and conditioning. And then even then we've got maybe like I don't know what the ratio is, best case scenario, maybe we're talking 10, 8, 6 to 1 athletes to coach. The whole goal is to get more and more attention. I think is a primary goal. So if you're working as an individual with a coach and you're following the same program as 10 other people, there's no difference. I think that's okay to say that's a little bit of a red flag. I mean, again, if we're looking at an individual and one coach, man, we should be able to really have a highly individualized effort there, not just here's my program for my athletes, here you go. So I agree, at least at face value, with what you're saying there.
Yeah, and it should no, I guess I've said everything I need to say about that. But yeah, if you're going like, I don't know, if you're a 5'1", 120-pound, 22-year-old girl or whatever, and you're getting the same exact program as, I don't know, a guy that's 6 foot and, I don't know, 220, it's like, what? Like you guys are getting the same workout, it's like that. It just makes no sense. But you see that very commonly, very, very, very commonly. You'll see it, and it's like, well, you guys are both. I've seen coaches even say like, well, they're both training into the same meet. It's like, you don't think there's, I don't know. It's wild. But yeah, that is a big, big red flag. But I also don't want to bag on the idea that, like, for the most part, when you are training for powerlifting and you are competing on the same meet, or I don't know, whatever your sport is, and you're coming into the same meet, there's going to be similar methods to peaking, right? I mean, you're still a squat, bench, deadlift. You're still trying to all get better at just a 1 rep max. So I'm not saying like they need to be wildly different. I mean, the concept's going to be generally the same, right? But there should be some individualism there.
Yeah. All right. So if we just kind of keep flowing through this, so if we're looking at this as a training schedule, then I think the next few things to know are, what are the names for each one of the phases of the schedule? Typically what you're looking at, if you're looking at like a training period or a block, is we're going to be talking about a microcycle, a mesocycle, and a macro cycle. That's a very common terminology. Microcycle, we're looking at days to weeks typically. Mesocycle, you're looking at months. And then a macrocycle, you're looking at months to a year. And it's not uncommon for, some, for instance, like an Olympic strength and conditioning program, some of those macro cycles you might be talking about 2 to 4 years. That actually wouldn't be very uncommon at all. And so just to be familiar with those terms, and the reason I think it's good to know the terms is because then when we talk about something like fatigue, and you'll see a couple very, very well-known authors out there. I'm sure you've heard of these individuals, Jake. Plisk and Stone, very commonly cited in strength and conditioning alongside this topic. If they seem to suggest that if we're looking at things in terms of maybe like, let's say a mesocycle, the blocks are usually often arranged in like a 3 to 1 loading paradigm. So, where you see the load gradually increase for the first 3 sort of microcycles, and then you'll have like this unloading phase for the 4th. And so you've got 4 total microcycles in that mesocycle. So that's what they call it, like a 3 to 1 block. And Plisk and Stone suggests that if you increase the number of these loading steps, if you spend more time loading, in other words, then you might have to have a greater number of unloading steps following it. So maybe we're talking, instead of 3 to 1, some like they suggest doing like a 4 to 2 paradigm. So what are your thoughts on that type of training scheduling? And then maybe what are some nuances that we could talk about?
So when you're saying unloading, you're kind of talking like you're taking a step back, deloading from whatever you've been loading at that time period, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's, I don't think that's a wrong way to go. It's a very, very common way to go with just about any kind of training.
Mhm.
I don't know if you know who Mike Tashir is. He's gotten
Shashir
fairly,
doesn't.
no, not a big deal. He's a pretty well-known strength and conditioning coach, but he has the idea that kind of goes against that
Okay.
it's like there is a transition week instead of a deload week, right? So for
Mhm.
example, so like if you're sticking to the 3-to-1, 4-to-1,
Mhm.
I've seen 3-to-1 and 4-to-1. It's usually the most common that I see. uh, let's say you're loading, X for 3 weeks, and then on the fourth week, you're just changing the load. And
Mhm.
so the idea is that you are not stimulating or overusing the same, or just using that same stimulus. You are changing the stimulus so that your body's not getting over fatigued from that, that same type of training. So I don't know, maybe for 3 weeks you were doing a ton of glycolytic leg work or something. I don't know. And then the fourth week, instead of doing a glycolytic style training, you're doing more of an aerobic style training. So the athlete still gets to train and adapt to something, but it's not the same stimulus. Or maybe it's like a heavier week, but it technically is an offload to what they were doing. So little bit of a just another like thought there. And then another thing I've
Well,
seen.
it almost sounds similar to me though. It sounds like you're basically saying you're basically doing an unloading. It's not you may not be calling it that, but if we're going from a heavier to a lighter load, I think that's a very similar concept of unloading. I mean, don't you think? Or or am
Yeah,
I missing
no,
something?
like, no, it's right. But it's
Mhm.
usually not you go heavier to lighter. It's usually something like he'll have you, it's more like you're doing bodybuilding work, really high glycolytic, short rest time. And then that fourth week, that offload week is actually like really heavy singles.
Mm.
And that will be, to him,
Mm.
is a different stimulus, right? And so
Okay.
that's just one, idea. I don't know how he always does this transition weeks. I know there's lots and lots of different ways that he's come up with, but the idea is there's a different stimulus to what you have been doing.
Hmm.
Which, I mean, I've seen people have some type of success with it long term. I can't really tell you as far as like, are you going to just burn that athlete out? um, because fatigue, in the sense, no matter how it comes, is fatigue, right? Like you
Yeah.
can get fatigued from like being overstressed. Like if you're going through a divorce,
Yeah.
versus like a lot of training, you're still fatigued, right? You're still not going to come in. And so it's a different way to stress different things, I guess. But I don't know. What are your
You
thoughts
know,
on that?
you're bringing up a really important topic, which I think that I'll attempt to cover it to a degree, maybe as we move along towards the end, where I think we'll have a discussion about where does periodization come from? What science is it rooted in? And the reason that's an important concept is because we're talking about stressors to the body. And so when you make the comment that somebody, there's physical stress like a load on the body, and then obviously that's the main focus of what we're talking about, but there are so many different applications of stress that occur to a human being. And like you mentioned, I had a divorce, I haven't slept well in 3 nights, I just took a giant exam like you did yesterday, yet I'm still having you talk to me today. I feel like that's a bit of a problem. Maybe I'm not being sensitive enough to your needs, Jake, but but these things, in all reality, these things do matter. And the stress on the body does not just have to take a physical form in terms of a barbell on the back. We're still talking about a nervous system that is interpreting stress, is interpreting things as threat, not a threat, and that very much can heavily dictate what will happen and with the body's response. So we'll cover that with some maybe mildly nerdy, moderately nerdy science towards the end. But you bring up a really good point. I guess where I was thinking originally, where I was going with this was building off of the idea that if we take a step back and we look at athletic performance long term. So I'll just bring up professional athlete, and the reason I like bringing that up is because they've had some time, right? They've been doing this for a very long time, since childhood, and now
And there's
they're,
money in it in the
well,
professional
yeah,
sports.
sure. When that professional athlete goes home, they just rest, whereas the Semi-pro, the grinding athlete is going to go, and then they're going to go and they're going to leave, and then they're going to go to a full-time job. And so that's a very important notable difference, because we can talk about these stress profiles. We can say that, well, instead of completely unloading or doing a very large deload that followed an incremental load, maybe we do a different variety of stress to the body. And because it's different, it's okay. That might be a reasonable thought. And quite frankly, it's not like we have strong evidence to suggest that's wrong necessarily. We don't. But we have to pay attention to some of the behavioral patterns, I think, that can help us, give us more insight. And that is that there's a large degree of rest occurring at the highest level of activity that may not be occurring at a lower level. And so I just think that's worth mentioning, you know?
No, I agree. I think, and to go back to your micro, meso, and macro cycles, basically, like, what I think you're getting at there is, if you're trying to set your own periodization up, you're trying to program for yourself, or maybe you're just trying to evaluate what your coach is doing or what your own program's doing, is there needs to be some type of offload, deload, some kind of back off of that stimulus every so often. And if there's not, that's probably a red flag. You can't just continually bang your head against the wall and expect, eventually you're going to run out of energy. So you do need a time period to be able to break off. So if you're getting a program, it's continuously getting heavier and heavier and heavier. Maybe the load's just getting bigger. Maybe it's not necessarily even getting heavier, but he's adding extra sets, adding extra reps, adding, shorter rest times. And that is not breaking for more than 4 or 5 weeks or so, then that's probably a red flag too. You need to do some type of deload or offload, unless you really have your performance enhancing drugs really on point and you are just really know what you're doing there. But even most people that are using the performance enhancers, you're not doing that right.
Well, so I don't know much about the performance enhancement side. I mean, I know some things that I probably know what we're going to discuss, at least the coaching concept, but I'll leave that alone for now. I think, why don't we do this? Why don't we pull up a little item here we can look at together and sort of have this discussion with something in front of us. I'll do a little screen share. Let me see if I can do a little portion of my screen here. Let's see. Yeah. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
So using this as just like a really, really common, like, single targeted block. What we're talking about here during this transition, we're not necessarily looking at strictly loading, unloading here, but we're looking at this in terms of phases. So this little prep phase here, where we had this like general preparatory period, we're looking at doing maybe some concentrated loading where we do, we focus on things like hypertrophy, right? That's like sometimes a foundational element before you start working on maximal strength. That's a very common thing you see. And then we can transition and do a little bit more like strength power, where we're starting to actually include some velocity component. And then we're basically getting closer and closer to competition. So you have this like preparatory phase, then you have this like competitive phase. What are your thoughts on this, just sort of at face value? How does this fit into this conversation? What do you think?
No, I think this looks pretty good. It looks like a couple, like, maybe, I guess it depends how long of a period we're talking about here, but they kind of look like meso cycles into maybe a football season kind of thing, because you're talking about like strength endurance. Maybe you're doing a lot of high repetition, short rest time kind of thing.
Yeah, this is a little bit more of a sport. Yeah, this is a little bit more of a sport model that we could say, simply because we can see this sort of primary goal at the competitive phase here, as we're looking at peak rate of force development. That's the RFD and power, which again, if I'm lifting as much as I possibly can up off the ground, it's a deadlift, I might be significantly less concerned with how the rate of force development develops throughout this preparation and competitive phase. But all of this is sort of setting the stage for looking at kind of peak rate of force development and power. So I think this would be a little bit more of a sport model that's, involving basketball, football, rugby, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what it looks
Yeah.
like. And that's like basically this is how you should put something together, right? Like you should
Hmm.
say, okay, let's work this backwards. So I need to
Yeah.
be peaked here, like maybe for it's track and field, or for football, it's like the playoffs, your state championship or
Yeah.
conference championship, whatever.
Hmm.
And then you're moving it backward. You're like, okay, so I want my strength and power to be very high during like that kind of main regular season, right? Like you still want to be moving around, you still want to be explosive, you still want to be powerful, but maybe not necessarily peak it. You're not wanting to be at like your absolute best because you really can only do that for such a short amount of time.
Hmm.
And then you're moving it backwards, and then this is kind of where you have to look at like, where are my weaknesses? What do I want to
Sure.
get better at? So to me, this might look like, I don't know, a running back that's trying to get a little bit bigger and stronger. Because one of the emphasis is okay, we're working on maximum strength. We're not trying to just hypertrophy through the whole thing. We're not trying to work on just endurance.
Yeah.
During your whole phase here, but they are trying to get stronger. And
Yeah.
then maybe you're using that strength endurance just to be able to build better maximum strength. But
Yeah.
everything leads into the next, which
Yeah.
I like. And once you kind of, let's say, that strength and endurance you build up, now you can do like 10 sets of 10 on your squats really,
Hmm.
well, and that's not burning you out. Then during that maximum strength period, you get a big PR on your squat. Now you're squatting like 500 pounds. But what that does is kind of like raise the ceiling, as far as your power output goes. So now
Hmm.
you might just be able to move 400 or 300 pounds that much quicker. And now that's your emphasis. It's like, I'm just trying to be explosive because, I need to be explosive on the football field or the basketball court or whatever. And now you're
Yeah.
just trying to peak at the end there, where maybe there's not an actual, weightlifting involved at that point. Maybe a little bit, but
Mhm.
you're probably more sport focused at that point.
Well, and as you sort of alluded to this earlier, this is a single targeted block here. So we really have, we do have this like end goal, but we have a very specific target. And if you move on to something like, let me move on to this next one. So we've got, and by the way, I've got the articles. I pulled these out of an article, so I didn't make these myself. And I've referenced each article down here. You'll see it at the bottom. Let me pull that back. If anybody wants to go review this information, here's the reference for you. It's sitting at the bottom of each one of these. If we move on here, then we've got an example of a single and then a multi-targeted block. And so, to your point is, we can't necessarily move towards one goal always. And again, we can't necessarily follow this linear path towards one goal and then peak, right at this one time. When we have a football season, you've got to be able to, it's how many, you got to play X amount of games. You got to be able to perform at your highest level each time. So it's not about this single point in time, as you would almost feel like this like traditional periodization would suggest. It's really about working kind of multiple goals at the same time. And so if we do that, we're looking at more like a multi-targeted block, and that's the one down here. And so we're trying to work on, we'll say the word fitness characteristics. You could exchange that with biomotors. Maybe we're looking on strength, and we're looking at like strength power or strength velocity. We're basically looking at multiple things at once. And we're trying to train them simultaneously. And that makes this a little bit harder. But again, not necessarily. I mean, if we're looking at a sport that requires that, we do have to be able to do that. And if we can see some of these loading strategies for a multi-targeted block, maybe um, we're looking at multiple fitness characteristics at the same time, but they're somewhat similar. So here they give the example of, strength, power, speed, and change of direction ability. So, there are some very similar, I'll use the word again, biomotors, so we all get comfortable with it, that exist between these things. When we're looking at strength, power, we look at speed. I mean, when you're exploding, and we're focusing on speed, I mean, you can easily see a relationship between strength, power, and that first explosive effort. And so, change of direction, if we're going as fast as we possibly can with a change of direction, we're talking about, a very powerful movement. So that's why there's some of these similarities that are shared throughout these characteristics. And so it's very possible to work on these things at the same time. And this is an illustration of how to do that. What are your thoughts on this?
No, this looks a lot better, and I'm glad. So, and this is how you should approach, things more like football, basketball, and whatnot, is that multi-targeted block.
Mm-hmm.
Um, But I guess it all just depends where your goals are. Because if your goal
Hmm.
is very, very simple, you only have one real thing you're worried about. That single targeted block is all you're going to need.
Yeah.
And but like if you're an athlete and you're right, like especially like let's say you're running back or I don't know, a point guard or whatever in basketball or a forward
Hmm.
in soccer, it's like you need multiple skills there. You need
Yeah.
to be strong, you need to be explosive, you need to be fast, and you have to have pretty good endurance too. You can't just be
Yeah.
like a 100-meter dash guy who you run maybe 3 races that weekend and you're done, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to be on the field or the court for a very extended amount of time and maintain as much power as you can.
Yeah.
And the downside to that is you'll never quite be, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but um, you'll never quite be peaked at one thing. You're never quite going to be your all-time fastest or your all-time, best in shape. Like you're not going to have your all-time aerobic capacity or your all-time strength ever during the
Yeah.
season.
Yeah. No, I think
But
if you're, yeah, no, I completely agree. Sorry, keep going. I completely agree.
you can be at like 90% of each of those, and the reason is because like you can only spend so much training time towards each thing, because you can't just develop like 4 single targeted blocks and
Yeah.
then call that a multi. You're going to end up spending 6 hours of training every day and you just can't recover from that. So you have
Yeah.
to get very, very detail oriented and say, okay, what's more important to me, my aerobic capacity, or is it my linear speed? Is it my change of direction? What is the most important? And maybe kind of organize those by importance.
Yeah.
And then because you're not going to be able to have them all, and if you try to reach for all of them, you're just going to overwork yourself and have none of it.
Yeah, and I think one of the big differences between this sort of single target and this multi-targeted block periodization method is with single target we're looking at concentrated loads here. So we really are spending maybe we're spending a month to 6 weeks in a hypertrophy zone. So that's really a pretty concentrated block. But if we've got these multiple goals we're working out at the same time, this is where we develop what I've seen labeled as what's called phase potentiation. Again, potentiation, we're looking at enhancing each phase of training. And one of the ways we do that is, the assumption is that we're enhancing these subsequent training sessions as we go. We're enhancing each one of these through sort of exploiting maybe a delayed training effect from the other. So what you're saying is that if we do a small block here, we're not going to get to the very, very possible pinnacle of that block before we move on. Our assumption is that whatever we did throughout that small period of time is going to carry over to the next phase well enough to where that will carry over to the next
Exactly.
phase. Yeah, so that's a really good comment there, and it's a really good thought because you have so many different things you have to be able to do well when we have some of these athletics, and you can't just focus on hypertrophy. If you spend a month on hypertrophy only, anywhere near a competitive training phase, you're in trouble. You're going to be, you're going to see your velocity profile come down. You will get specific results for that specific task. And if you slow everything down and it's just about however many reps you can possibly get, if that's where you stay and for a large block of time, you might be losing out on some of the strength, power, and the rate of force of development that could occur if you were to have moved on sooner and kept developing that profile. So that's a really good thought.
Then
Yeah.
you're confusing your body right there too, because you're like, you're going out and performing very, very hard in
Yeah.
whatever your sport is, and then you turn around and do a big hypertrophy training, and it's like, what are we even trying to adapt towards, right? Because your body's
Yeah.
always trying to adapt and be more efficient at whatever you're doing,
Yeah.
just because it's a survival machine, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And if all you're doing is doing all these different workouts because you're trying to get a little bigger, a little faster, a little stronger, a little more explosive, it's like,
Yeah.
well, we're just going to get efficient at surviving because we don't know what's going on, right? And so you don't actually adapt to anything anymore.
Yeah. 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 That's a really good thought. Why don't I have another thing we can kind of look at together here. I'll share my screen again. I think you might appreciate this as well. So here we're basically just looking at, we're looking at volume, we're looking at intensity, we're looking at technique, and this inverse relationship between volume and intensity. And this is kind of as we go through sort of this general physical training, and then we move on to more sports specific physical training as SSPT, followed by competition. As we get closer to that goal, generally speaking, these are some very common themes that you'll see in these periodization methods, is that there is a little bit of an inverse relationship between volume intensity, and we're getting closer to some specificity here. So typically when we first start with this, we're sort of laying the foundation with this general physical training. We'll see volume at a certain spot. We'll see intensity might be a little lower, volume's a little higher. And then technique, I don't know if I appreciate the technique part of this as much, because I think that with a sport like powerlifting, that's not necessarily accurate, because
I
technique
don't know. I like it quite a bit. I'm going to be
yeah,
honest. I like it quite a
yeah,
bit.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
And
go
the only
ahead.
reason I say that is, sorry, can I just cut you off right
No,
there?
please
But
go ahead. Fire away. Yeah.
is you don't want to be peaked year round. And I see a lot of people that like, well, technique's everything in powerlifting, and it is a massive part. It is a massive part in any sport.
Uh-huh.
But again, you are not seeing, if you go into the professional athlete world, you are not seeing people trying to stay peaked year round, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you don't see, Aaron Rodgers, like I was telling you this yesterday, you don't see him throwing a football for 4 or 5 months. He's not sitting there trying to be in like this peak performance year round. He'd end up having like, I don't know, messed up ligaments in his elbows or like some shoulder issues or whatever. You just can't do it year round.
Mm-hmm.
And to try to push technique year round, I think it's a little bit asinine, to be honest, just because like if you're in a low bar squat, let's say you low bar squat, you have your competition style bench,
Uh-huh.
and you're a conventional deadlift, you're a conventional deadlifter, and you are trying to do that multiple times a week, and you're always hounding that technique. You almost limit yourself to improving in a way, just because you are you're almost holding yourself back from working harder. And the only reason I say that is because we are all like emotional human beings, and what's like if you're staying in those competitive techniques year round,
Yeah.
your low bar squat or whatever, and you're going to take certain weight and you're like, man, that felt better a couple months ago, or like why am I doing this now? I'm starting to shift onto my leg, and because my knee, maybe like their knees are starting to hurt because they're always I don't know, whatever it is, but there's no difference in stimulation ever. And I think that's where we really get caught up, is there are other ways to improve your volume and improve your strength without necessarily having to practice that technique year round. And that doesn't mean like if you're practicing your technique year round, you're wrong and you're doing it wrong, right? I'm not trying to get at that either. Yeah. But I'm saying like if you get to a spot where like I feel like I hit a plateau, I feel like I'm doing something wrong with my technique. I all of a sudden I'm shifting, or my knees are caving in, or like this, whatever it is. Sure. And you notice these things that are happening. It is okay to step back and say, you know what, I'm not even going to work with a barbell for a while. It is okay to do that. And there are other ways to get stronger and put plenty of load on your body and improve those weaknesses without it. And I think that can be very refreshing too, in a mental way.
Well, and it almost sounds like, maybe I'm hearing you wrong, Jake, but it almost sounds like you're equating technique with peak load. Is that kind of what you're suggesting? That when you're hearing technique, you're thinking people are trying to stay peaked all year long, so their technique is related to maximal effort. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Well, not that even, but I think if you get too focused on your squat, even if it's a low intensity, let's say you're doing like, I don't know, 5 by 10 at 45%, I don't know, something super light, load is very, very low, but that still can get to a point like, oh man, it can get mind numbing to a point where you're not just coming in and working hard and getting that little dopamine release, when maybe you could have, I don't know, got on that little, like the pit shark or something, and or did some split squats or whatever, and just work hard, where you're not thinking like, okay, is my squat perfect? You're not sitting there analyzing the video and like, okay, what's going on here? And trying to perfect it. And again, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to be squatting year round, but the idea of like the technique coming up as you get closer and closer to competition, I take that as a way of like, maybe you don't even have to do your competition list until you're actually fairly close to your actual competition. Like maybe 16 weeks out or 20 weeks out, or I don't know, 6 months out, maybe you only do 1 or 2 sets of squats like a week, right? You just kind of come in, okay, got a little bit there. Maybe it's even at the end after you've fatigued yourself for a little, so you're not overthinking it. But and then you gradually bring up the you make that more of, you kind of eliminate the accessory stuff, eliminate anything that is not a competition lift. And to me, the technique is that's coming up, is that's where the energy is going now. The energy is going towards the actual competition lift, or in any other sport, you know, it could be whatever, but the emphasis is not so much on the technique. The emphasis is fixing, you know, whatever is keeping you back from being able to lift more weight. And I think that doesn't have to be through a competition squat, bench, deadlift. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. I think, you know, when I see this graph, I think of something that I like and something that I don't like. So, you know, what I don't necessarily like about it is if I try to sell technique to somebody, oftentimes, you know, it might be in the presence of an injury, or I'm kind of pushing for the, you know, let's unload the heck out of this thing. Let's get back to grassroots. And we might be, again, like you're saying, we might be starting without a bar. I can't really accomplish that very often. Most people won't stop to that degree, but we might be starting back with foundational stuff. And so I like the idea of, you know, with general prep, I like, you know, if it's appropriate, there are many times where might be working very strongly on technique for sort of these, I guess we'll say, motor patterns. And it might be using a lunge, it might be using a Bulgarian split squat, it might be using an overhead squat, whatever it is to accomplish a certain goal. And it might be very technique heavy, and volume might be high, but intensity is going to be very low, because I might want to practice this several times a day. So we might be talking about body weight. We might be talking about, in some cases, if the injury's bad enough, limiting even body weight in a pool, working on some things, or with some band assisted things like that. So there's definitely a nuance there for me. The thing that I think I do like about, you know, this general preparation phase, this general physical conditioning, is I like removing a little bit of specificity every once in a while, because, you know, we know that there's this said principle, the specific adaptation of imposed demands. Now, that could mean that we want to get really, really good at something, and that's fine. And we train towards that, and that's great, and that has its place. But for goodness sake, sometimes we need to take an athlete that is micro-focused on these few things and just say, man, just go play. Just go do these, just go play with your kid, or go run around and go do something else, something completely different, and just have fun with it, and just get a little bit more well-rounded with your general conditioning through just disconnecting from whatever the heck it is you're doing. Zone out a little bit. Forget about this whole foot. What's my foot and ankle doing? So at the same time, there's that. So it's like there's a pro and a con for me here.
Yeah, and I guess it all depends on how you define the word technique, right? Because if you're defining the word technique as in like what you're saying, like, you know, maybe as a and that's a little bit different, because maybe like you're saying technique is like, oh look, okay, she's not using her hamstrings when she deadlifts. We need her to learn to feel how to use her hamstrings, right? And that's technique. And instead of actually deadlifting, you're saying, I don't know, let's go do a elevated, you know, front foot split squat, and I'm gonna like do some leg curls, pump up your hamstrings so much that there's so much blood in there that you can't not feel them. Then I'm gonna have you do the split squat so you can feel that contraction. And technically, I guess you could call that technique work, but you're also not working on your specific skill. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But you're looking at, you know, whatever your sport is, you see some people do some insane things without great equipment and not training the way that you're supposed to train. Like you see some insane football players that just did hill sprints, or that they took their mom's station wagon and pushed it in the cornfield with their brothers, you know, or they take like a crappy sled and they, you know, pulled it across the dirt field. And so like, I guess my point is sometimes you need to step back and say, like, you know, I don't need to worry about how my 90% one rep look and overanalyze it every single week until exhaustion, because there are other ways to get better and to get stronger. And sometimes, like you said, just go out and play, like go, you know, maybe go on a hike, like take your wife or your husband or your dog or whatever, and go on a hike, because you can still get a lot of work done just going on a hike, or whatever. So sometimes, or go do a, like, I know this is going to come off crazy, but go like do some CrossFit or something. Like go to the local box, go do a CrossFit workout, do a different kind of training, and just go train for the sake of training. Like if like, man, my glutes are weak, my quads are weak, my whatever's weak, go find a way to train that is not your lift, because that can really go a long way. And it can be very mentally, it can take off, it can be a really deloading mentally, I guess.
Yeah, it can. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that might be these concepts of these breaks that we're saying. I think that feeds really well into our discussion about sort of where, I guess, the history of periodization, where it sort of comes from, and what it's really based on. Now you may have heard of this, and I'll pull this up. We can screen share the general adaptation syndrome. This is, this is where you see periodization really has its grassroots as far as, how coaches quote the science. They're always talking about the general adaptation syndrome. And so we don't have to get really too in depth to this, and I'll try to drag my little thing over here. But essentially the idea here is, and we'll talk about, where GAS, general adaptation syndrome, comes from in a second, but I want to bring this up because it's a very easy way to kind of look at these different stages of the general adaptation syndrome. Again, I've referenced it down here. The idea is here that there's a little bit of a patterned response. And this sort of this level of adaptation that the body gets it really begins with this sort of initial decline in the alarm stage, followed by an increase with prolonged application of a stressor, or maybe a dose too high in magnitude, resulting in exhaustion. So we see this like alarm reaction, we see this baseline decline, and then we start to adapt over time with resistance. And then if it's just too much, we go into exhaustion and we kind of fail. I think, people can screenshot this, and this is a nice little picture of, how at least we think the general adaptation syndrome sort of flows according to Hans Selye and his work. And in understanding each one of these phases, we'll try to keep it simple. If we look at this sort of alarm reaction, the idea is that our nervous system, specifically like the sympathetic, we're talking like, fight or flight. Basically this gets activated with this initial stress. And, this adrenal gland is going to secrete these stress hormones, cortisol, or, we're talking adrenaline. And that's the initial response of the body. It's this alarm stage, what's just happened. Maybe this is a new stress or a different stress. And then we've got this resistance stage where the body is basically trying to adapt to this new situation, and it's trying to restore homeostasis. And then it's followed by this exhaustion phase where the body theoretically has sort of depleted some of these, resources, trying to attempt to sort of repair itself, trying to attempt this maintaining homeostasis. But then, if this original threat doesn't pass, or it's just a little bit too much for the body, or continues for too long, then it can't necessarily continue into recovery. It'll go into this exhaustion stage. And so, but I just think this is a nice little chart. What are your thoughts on this? Is this useful as sort of a foundational element to why we think that these periodization methods ebb and flow the way they do?
No, yeah, I do. I think this is important to know at least the general concept as an athlete too, to realize like, okay, whoa, this was like a little bit more fun last week than it was this week, right? And like the first week, maybe you're like, oh, this is different. This is kind of fun, whatever. And then the next week, you're like, wow, I kind of like, I can't get going. Like maybe it was a little bit harder, and there's a reason for it. And then all of a sudden and that's pretty common. Like the first like 1 or 2, 3 weeks of a training block, I'll have people come in, and maybe we just moved into hypertrophy, style block, and they're like, dang, like I barely got my, I barely got this done or whatever. I couldn't finish the last set. My legs are jello, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden around like week 3, they're like, hey, this was easy. Like I could have done more. They're like, oh, can I go do a little bit more? And you're like, no, no, don't go do more. Like this is what we're trying to get to, right? Like I guess like there's a time and a place where you might be leaving your workout feeling like, oh man, I am gassed, like that destroyed me. And other times where you're going to be like, wow, I can keep going. And you probably actually shouldn't, do more for a specific reason, because you're trying to get a response from your body. And that, what you're showing right there is like, that's what should happen when you put some kind of new stimulus on your body. And if you're just kind of doing that same thing over and over, you kind of miss out on this. You don't ever see that like you're adapting to something new. You're just kind of either going to exhaust, or you just kind of hang out there, I guess, for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and this is probably perhaps maybe one of the most fun parts for me is, there's been quite a bit of criticism about periodization, and it's one of these things that it's been around a while, and within the strength and conditioning community, this concept goes really largely unquestioned. And we do have some research that looks at periodization versus a linear progression, and some evidence would suggest that it's better for strength change. And then there's of course these different methods of programming, like undulating methods versus a block periodization. There's this debate about which one's better. There's some evidence to suggest these undulating methods might be better, but then there's quite a few studies that counter and say no, block methods seems to be better for strength change. These are generally, like you mentioned yesterday with your criticism, very fair. It's a very short-term studies usually in duration. We're talking about weeks to a few months, which is very well worth mentioning, because as you know, with coaching the athletes that you do and doing the training yourself, you have a 5-year goal. If you're trying to add 100 pounds to your squat and you're already, in the top 10%, if you're trying to add 100 pounds to your squat in a year, that's completely ridiculous. If you're trying to add 50 pounds to your squat in a year, sometimes that might be a little bit of a reach. So it's a very fair criticism to say, like, well, we have these little studies in their short term, but nothing long term. I just think that one thing I really want to bring up is that this foundational science for periodization, there are a lot of authors out there that point out how weak the science is. And I think it's worth mentioning that this general adaptation syndrome, it really assumes a lot. And there's been a lot of information that's been disproven about that GAS, that general adaptation syndrome. So if we I'm going to say 7 out of 10 nerdy right now. And again, you have full authority to tell me to stop, and I will. But you might find this interesting. This is this sort of like, everybody brings this stuff back to Hans Selye in his description of the general adaptation syndrome. But really, we have to look at this like the history of stress, I think is more appropriate. And that's going to bring you back to the 1800s, and I think 1850s, or I think I had that date right, where we're going all the way back to the French physiologist Claude Bernard. He's the one who started this whole topic of this like interior milieu, this like balanced internal environment where, the body's these body's internal like cellular processes are sort of accounting for and adapting to all these external variations that the body goes through. And the goal of those little cellular processes are to maintain this like stable internal environment. And that is almost where this work began, is almost like there's this biologic like preset point that's sort of always steady. And then it will always stay steady because it always reacts to keep itself steady. But then you have to fast forward the clock from there. And then we look at like the early 1900s, and you're going to look at Walter Cannon's work. And I think most of these individuals are from Harvard. That's not a plug for Harvard. I didn't go to Harvard or anything.
I don't even know if I've heard of Harvard. It's not that big of a deal.
Anyway, so Walter Cannon's, he's expanding on Bernard's work, and he's now talking about that he's suggesting that there's this arousal shift that an organism will go through with these sort of internal sort of steady states. And that this little shift that occurs of these steady states are necessarily, we're trying to keep an equilibrium, but we're moving away from this I guess stable set point, if you will. So we're going to see a lot more fluctuation in the internal environment, a lot more than Claude Bernard was suggesting. And that's where you hear the concept of equilibrium. That's where it comes from. It's Walter Cannon's work. So the suggestion is that arousal, will shift this organism's set of these steady state conditions significantly more to try to maintain this equilibrium. But there's not this like finite, stable set point that exists. There's a lot more fluctuation, I guess. And then we fast forward from there, and then we have Hans Selye and his work. And that's really founded in, his work when he was looking at stressed rats, where he would like introduce these crazy amount of stresses to these rats. Maybe it was he would like shock them with electricity. He would starve them, like make them really fatigued with activity, or I think he would fluctuate temperature too to the extreme. And basically, his work is suggesting that he would do all these different stresses, and he seemed to find that regardless of what he did, the adaptations of the systems were, you really could predict them, and they shared some commonalities. And so this general adaptation syndrome is really, it's encapsulating Selye's thesis, I guess, that all these biological challenges are encountered in like this predictable fashion, and that, progressing through that it progresses through the same phases no matter what the stress is. You've got the alarm stage, you've got the resistance stage, and then, if the challenge is overwhelming, then you have this fatigue stage, or this exhaustion stage.
Yeah.
So when you hear coaches talk about periodization, it has gone almost completely unquestioned all this time. And you'll hear people cite homeostasis, you'll hear people cite general adaptation syndrome. So that's the history up to that point. Now, here's the big problem. This is a really big problem, is that this has now moved on to a lot of criticism where, this last quarter of the 20th century, way back when, there's a lot of limitations they started to discover. And, the idea that the stress is this completely predictable, biologically mediated event that occurs, it's been shown to be false. And it's on several accounts. And I think the easier one to understand is that we've got increasingly convincing evidence that these stress responses are not completely generalized, and they're not non-specific. They actually are highly individualized and very context specific. So in other words, you can't just assume that this body goes for all these peripheral changes and that all those are just preset and they'll occur that same pattern all the time. It's almost absurd now if we look at neuroscience, because these biologic stresses are largely dependent on the brain, and the general adaptation syndrome almost suggests that they're almost completely independent of the brain. And so, if we fast forward to most recent evidence in neuroscience, and this absolutely translates to strength and conditioning, there is unbelievably convincing evidence at this point that the brain is this master organ. It is responsible for orchestrating all these central and peripheral processes that occur. And that's how we tend to adapt to things. And so that concept is called allostasis. And it's not easy. It's a complex set of things like emotions. There's physiological subsets to it. There's, immunology you have to appreciate. There's psychology. And so if we're saying things like, and you've mentioned this, Jake, you've already alluded to this several times, you're talking about emotional stress. If we say things like emotion, and if we say things like psychology plays a role, which we all have seen anecdotally when we trained any number of athletes, you've noticed this. This is a very real thing. Then we basically are saying that this GAS, this preset condition, can't occur, because the fact that you're stressed out because you lost your job, if that affects your training to any notable degree, then it's almost like the general adaptation syndrome is basically just kind of disproven. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. So how do you tie that? So what is your thoughts on the general adaptation syndrome then? Because
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, like I guess it depends on how you want to, like, I guess, define it and where its limitations are too, right?
Yeah, I think it on a very large scale, and to communicate this to an audience where I really want them to capture a concept, what I would say in this context is that general adaptation syndrome, there are several notable weaknesses to it that have been cited, and this has been cited, like I said, all the way since like the last, I guess, quarter of the 20th century. That's when all this Hans Selye's work started to get criticized, and since then we have seen just a huge amount of neuroscience research come out that talks to us about how important things like context are whenever we have these processes occur. So one of the things you'll hear very commonly is that, your response, your pain response, your stress response is oftentimes, it's in response to a perceived threat. And that's the brain that's interpreting that threat. So we've got psychology in place. So let's go over an example. Let's go over an example, because that way we can really tie this together. So let's say you are a professional, like you play the piano for a living. Okay. That's how you make all your money. It's how you support your family. And you're out messing around, and you go to like make a move, or you go to catch something and you jam your finger, and it, jammed your finger before, it hurts, right? What are the consequences of that professional piano player when he jams his finger? And what's the perceived threat there versus if you're a soccer player and you jam your finger? That's not even a thought in your mind. You just get back on the field. You probably aren't even going to tape it. If you break your finger and you're playing soccer, you're going to tape
Popsicle
it.
stick.
You're going to go right back out. It's not. It hurts. The initial insult hurts, but the processes that occur beyond that initial insult, it's in part based on a perceived threat. So that's the psychology. That's the emotional part of this. If you break your finger and you play the piano for a living, that's a very big deal. And so your response to that injury, if you can appreciate, is very likely going to be very different process internally than an individual who doesn't care if they break their finger, because it doesn't really affect them.
That's such a good thought. Yeah, that's a very, very, very interesting thought to tie that in. Sorry, keep going. I'm really
no, that's it. It's just that it's all the stuff that that we picked up on as clinicians and coaches because you picked up on this. We've had conversations about this. I even called you in the middle of a run. I think I was feeling a little emotional, and I just wanted to send you some love. And I was just like, here's a couple of compliments for you, man. And one of them was that you have this person come in and they've got a lot going on. I won't mention names, but they've got a lot of things going on. Maybe there's a personal injury to a family member. Maybe there's some caretaking roles. Maybe maybe we lost the job. Whatever it is, there's this mounting emotional response. It's just like this fire burning, and there's all these things going on. Then there's all these stressors, and then all of a sudden we have it just so happens we have an injury during that time. Okay, and it's to the one thing that we really love to do and that we get a break when we get to do. Now that's affected. So what's my perceived threat there? And how do I adapt the training for that individual, separate from maybe like, maybe I injured my back and it hurts, but like, I don't know, whatever, I'll just change my workout. I don't care. That's going to behave differently than I have a competition in 6 months and this is what I love to do. And this is my joy. And so all this stuff plays a role and absolutely will and should affect the training and should affect the training schedule. That's where my thoughts go here. And that's the reason why I think that if we just go off these like biological presets and that's all we have as our background, our foundational science, we're missing a lot.
Yes.
Opinion.
Yeah.
Not just my opinion, but yeah.
No, yeah. I mean, I think that's why a lot of the times you can see people come out from school with a bachelor's or even a master's or whatever. They get the degree and they know the science is behind it. Like they know the biological responses to if I do this, it's going to trigger this. It's going to make my body do this. This will be the response to it. These can be the limiting factors, X, Y, Z. You know all the book smarts of it, right? Like you can really name all the physiology that's going to happen. But it's different when you're working with an actual human being, right? Yeah. They are not a robot where it's like, okay, this is how you should train if everything is optimal, right? Yeah. If everything is optimal and they, I don't know, are a professional athlete, great, that's awesome. But I mean, I guess even with professionals, they have a lot of psychological issues sometimes too. It's just so much stress. But the point is like, as good as the training may seem, as good as the periodization might be, as well thought out as it is, you are still people and it's not going to work. It's never going to work 100%. You got to be ready to adjust on the fly. And so if you are an athlete yourself or a coach, you have to realize that you one of the biggest like skills you can develop is to swallow your pride sometimes and say, you know what, this lift is not going to be here today. Or maybe I'm not ready for this competition, or maybe like I need to change my coaching style for this client. Not that means like you don't have a good idea. It's not that you don't understand the physiology or the training adaptations or whatever, But sometimes you have to take a step back and say, okay, I'm a person, or,
Yeah.
this is a person, and say, what is the best for them or me long term?
Yeah.
What can I do to enjoy life right now? Because if you just had, you lost your job, or, something crazy's going on, you're going through a divorce, and it depends on the person, how they respond to it. But for the most part, you should really just do what you enjoy to do. And you got to be careful during those times of high stress too, because a lot of injuries can happen. And so, like, if you have a coach and there is something going crazy in your life, like you're going through a divorce or lose your job, you don't feel like you're sounding annoying when you say, like, go tell them, because that can really change things. That should be like, we want to avoid more stress in the long term, It's like, if something crazy happens and then tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. you're supposed to go to the gym and max out on your squat.
Yeah.
Not a good idea. Not like, and so sometimes you have to be like,
sure.
okay, I was looking forward to this, but it's going to be there, right? It's still going to be there later. And we need to be able to, like, kind of swallow your pride and say, okay, we're going to change.
And I think these implications are so far reaching, because I mean, a couple things come to my mind is, okay, so we have a showcase in 6 weeks, or we've got a college scout coming out to check me out in 6 weeks, or whatever it is. We've got these hard dates in mind, and these goals that in our mind, if we don't reach them, we're a complete failure. And now we won't go to college, and we won't get a scholarship. This and that occurs. And then I'm going to poke the bear a little bit here, because I get the opportunity to. We've got mom and dad involved. And maybe mom and dad have got the same thing in mind, and they're pushing the kid, and it's all about this date, and it's all about everything that has to go perfectly up to that date. What's the stress on that individual? Maybe we've got a pro athlete, and they've got a whole team involved, and maybe that surgeon really wants his surgery to go well quickly because he's on ESPN. Then we've got the strength and conditioning coach that's involved, and he's got an Instagram account, and he wants to be able to say he got LeBron better in X amount of weeks. We've got all these agendas involved, and it's going to be hard for somebody to step up and say, you know what? Like, we're adding a lot of stress to this athlete's life, and this isn't necessarily the best course of care for this person. That's not an easy call to make. I'll stop there, because the negatives I don't want to get too negative. We could go a bunch of different directions with that.
But I think the point is, a lot of the times, is like, you need to, like, step back and be able to self-evaluate sometimes and be like, okay, let me look at my situation realistically. And there's sometimes you cannot change the date. If you have a scout coming, or you have the Olympics, or you have, like, a championship, those dates don't change. You can't just say, oh, I'll just move it back, or whatever. Those, I get those, but sometimes when you're training into those, your training doesn't need to be perfect for that to be a perfect day.
Exactly.
Sometimes you need to step back and say, I'm going to recover. I'm going to get a little bit of me time. I'm going to do what I enjoy to do. Get a little bit of dopamine fluctuation, so you just kind of enjoy things again. And let's just, like, and step back from training. And especially if you're like, man, sometimes you might be 2 weeks away from your competition, and you were supposed to finish your last heavy lifter. You should be doing this. But a lot of times the work's already done at that point. You're not going to lose your strength or your speed. Let's just avoid injury, and let's get you in there as healthy as you can, with the best mindset that you can. But you need to be able to step back and say, okay, my performance is not physical. It's not purely physical. There is no performance that is purely physical, right? It is a very emotional, it's a mental thing. And if those aren't taken care of too, you will not perform at your highest level. So make sure you're taking care of those too. Because if you sacrifice your mental, emotional, spiritual health for something you perceive as a physical benefit, are you actually going to benefit your performance, right?
Yeah.
Now we're getting a therapy talk, but
I know. Well, it's a beautiful branch in the right direction. I'm glad we went there. I really am. I think I don't want to be. I want to be respectful of your time. It's already like 7:30. It's an hour and a half. So I think we'll end it here. Oh, you're good to go, huh? I think what we'll do is I think this is a nice little foundation, and I'll write all this down for people that don't make it to the end of this thing. But this is kind of an introduction, concepts, terminology, stuff like that. we didn't write a program down, but as I think we do, I'm sure there'll be a few episodes involved here. Maybe the next one we're getting specific within each sport. We'll do some periodization examples and have those
Yeah, I would love
discussions.
that.
We did a little bit of that today, but we'll branch out and get more specific. I'll do one for maybe rehab of something. We can talk about specifically for powerlifting. We can talk about, I know you do with a lot of track athletes. We can break out into that. There's been some cool studies on that. Maybe that's next, and then we can.
Yeah, we could just kind of
play
do
with
like
this.
sports in general too, like
Yeah.
kind of that football, basketball, soccer player where,
Yeah.
you kind of need that little bit of speed, little bit of agility, a little bit of endurance. How do I kind of peak that? How do I maintain it? Yeah, I would love to do that. I think that
So
sounds good.
we'll give some examples of like written programs. I know everybody's going to want to see examples of written programs. We'll definitely do that. I won't just
Practical
pull from the
application.
research articles. Yeah, but we'll actually draw some programs. We'll talk about, why we did it. We'll get to that too. So everybody can have that to look forward to. I'm really looking forward to the rest of this, man, because I think this will be, for the individuals that are willing to learn and hang in there, this will be, I think, the most, far-reaching, I think most complete evaluation of these training methods that exist. So I'm super excited to do it with you. And I think this is a great start. I really enjoyed all the little side discussions we had, all the little peripheral topics. I think it's perfect. It's just so fun to do,
Yeah, no, I agree. I really enjoyed this quite a bit. This is stuff that I can just talk about for a long time. There was one thing you mentioned in there that I forgot to come back to. Is you were talking about like linear versus undulating versus like block or like what are, because there's people that really get heated like, oh, linear doesn't work or this doesn't work, and I don't want to get into it too much because I know we're kind of toning down.
Sure.
But all of them can work and all of them can be beneficial, and the thing that the studies lack when you're looking at it, you really need to be in tune to, is what were you doing before. What you were doing before is going to be very, very dependent on what kind of periodization you can use to get in there, because an undulating can be very beneficial for some people. A linear can be very beneficial for some people, but it all depends on what you did before. Because when you're talking about peaking, someone comes up to me and they'll be like, I have 7 weeks to my competition, can you help me get ready? It's like, I mean, I can do my best, but we really need to know what you've been doing, because you can't really peak somebody if you don't know what happened before. So don't get in an argument with somebody. Like the linear undulating block, it really doesn't matter. It just all matters how it's been set up to continue. All of them can be very, very good. It's just the way you use them. I've used all of them.
Yeah, and quite frankly, there are, I mean, I don't think people realize it when they actually look at their written program, but you're going to see every single method of, there'll be some linearity to it. There's no such thing as no linear progression at all. I just don't think that exists in a realistic program, nor does a program never have any undulation, nor does any program not have any sort of conjugate method to it. It's silly to suggest otherwise. And I think if you are suggesting it, you really haven't outlined the program well enough. I think what I would suggest, since you brought it up, is you said, the research, you brought that up, so we've got to tackle this really quickly.
Okay, sorry about this.
No, you had to bring it up. I'm gonna definitely talk about it. So what I've got here is a slide. This is a recent review that is basically looking at all these articles, including other systematic reviews that evaluate, linear versus undulating periodization, or what have you, different periodization methods. And here's what I think. This is an important topic, and I think one of the big takeaways, or a couple of the big takeaways, are that not one of these studies included in this review, and these are the higher quality studies that get quoted all the time. Not
I like
one
these
of
concerns
them,
a lot.
Yeah, not one of them actually incorporated a non-periodized variation. When we look at the methods and what studies they evaluated, not one of these reviews, not one of these high quality research papers actually had a comparator where it was actually not periodized. That's a huge deal, because we're talking apples versus oranges. If you don't have an apple and you don't have an orange, then you can't compare an apple to an orange. And that's just very simply stated. Another thing to know is this is another question they asked is, these tested predictions, do they actually look at the timing of these adaptations? Again, if our whole premise is that periodization allows optimal timing of these different adaptations, and that's the whole deal, then did we actually look at that and analyze that well? And the answer is no. Not in one of these studies did we actually prove that any of these adaptations occurred along the timeline that we thought it did. So, I mean, talking about criticizing the evidence, then we have these additional concerns. We're off here to the side. You can just read these. Did the study, the study analyze multiple versus single sets? So that shouldn't have been there. That happened with a number of these. And then
I'm looking through those.
Oh yeah,
I love that.
One analyzed low volume versus high volume, not periodized versus non-periodized, and the conclusions were that periodization was or was not as successful. So
that's garbage. That's not how you said.
So
I don't know if you noticed this with with research in general, is that the way these are getting set up is getting bad. Like I've seen like 7 out of 10 of them don't even have a hypothesis. Like they don't even have a hypothesis, and they never test their hypothesis in general. And you're like, didn't we learn how to do this in 8th grade, like science class? Like you're supposed to have a hypothesis. And I don't know if it's like just because they're trying to set up a study and they don't want to be proven wrong or whatever. But, and I know I'm kind of getting into a weird tangent now, but the way the research is set up sometimes is very interesting, where it comes to this, and it's like conclusion, periodization does not work. And it's like, you didn't even compare them, right? It's, so sometimes the research can be very, very aggravating. And like I was kind of telling you yesterday, that sometimes it'll say, oh, this didn't work to help this person get stronger. And it's like, well, yeah, it was 8 weeks. Like, that's not the way that you would utilize that anyway. It's almost set up for failure, right? And so it can be very aggravating. So be very careful, I guess, when you're looking into research, because it can be set up. Like, I don't know if it's like, I don't want to say it's deliberate or not, but it can be set up to fail sometimes.
Well, I don't know if I've come across an article in a peer-reviewed journal that didn't have a hypothesis. I might be a little bit, with my search strategy, I might be, if something's not in a peer-reviewed journal that at least has a reasonable impact factor. In other words, if it's not a reputable journal, I'm not going to read it. So I probably haven't been privy to something that doesn't even have a hypothesis. But I will say that, our whole goal for analyzing this information is, at the end of it, we want to be able to derive, ideally, a cause and effect relationship, right? Or if we're doing a comparator, we want to be able to say with some degree of certainty that something is or is not as effective as maybe the others. So again, with the apple and orange analogy, if we don't have clearly an apple and clearly an orange, then we can't talk about how those compare and contrast very well. And another thing I think is worth mentioning, talking about like a cause and effect relationship, you have to have a certain level of evidence to do that, right? You can't do that with a survey, although some people sure do seem to think they can. I think you have to have, a
that's
certain
another
degree.
one
So maybe
that's very bad.
Yeah, I know. Everybody mentions surveys, but that's okay. They just don't know how to. That's fine. So if we're talking about maybe a randomized trial, or we're looking at, ideally, a lot of people will want to look at like a systematic review. We try to look at evidence to that level to suggest that maybe we need to change some sort of practice that we're doing. But the problem is, if your systematic review is looking at a bunch of trash articles that are not really coming to, their conclusions are very inappropriate, their methods are shoddy at best, they're very weak, very biased studies, then really all you have is a review of a bunch of crummy studies. And so, if the systematic review calls that out and looks at some of the limitations and strengths, that's nice, but you have to keep that in mind. And if we have a randomized trial that's a poorly designed randomized trial, it's not as simple as this randomized trial showed this, therefore we're good to go. It's more complicated than that. So I have seen, in this case, the reason I brought up that review was, again, we've got this largely unquestioned method. It's stood the test of time, so to speak, when in reality, the science has not stood the test of time. And then when we go to our articles that show actually it is more effective, and you look at the article and they don't even have a non-periodized group, then we don't have much to talk about yet.
What are you trying to prove here, right? Yeah, I agree. But yeah, we can, but yeah, I really like the idea of what you're saying with the future episodes too. There's still a lot to go into, a lot of practical application. You can even look at physiological responses if you want to get into, more on that side of things, that could do a lot of research on, which I get very excited about. So lots of good stuff
Cool.
still to come.
Yeah,
But I
very much.
really
Yeah,
like the stuff that we talked about
awesome.
today.
Cool. Well, thanks, man. I really do appreciate your time. I'm glad I got to spend this time with you. It's a very, very fun conversation. And more to come, and we'll just be in touch about what we want to maybe cover next exactly, and then we'll just we'll pick a date and we'll run with it.
All right, sounds good. Let's get them
All
done
right.
over Christmas break, huh?
Yeah, for sure. We could probably make it happen. No problem. Yeah. Yeah, it'd
All
be a
right. Hey,
blast.
sounds good.
All right, man. I'll post this probably tomorrow or so, and I'll send it to you. Maybe like a Google Drive link or something, and you can do whatever you want with the video, but I'll make sure you get it.
Okay, cool. No, I appreciate
Okay.
it.
All right, brother.
Hey, have a good night.
You too. Bye bye.